I forgot Kaddish. I stood at a sacred spot with a small group of Jews prepared to lead the prayer. I knew the words. I was 28, 29 years old. They didn't come out. That happened in 1994, and I remember it as if it were yesterday. I couldn't say Kaddish. You see, I was standing at Babi Yar. I was a fifth-year rabbinic student at the Hebrew Union College, and I had just arrived in Kiev to spend 3 weeks visiting nascent Jewish communities. I was there to teach, lead Shabbat, talk about progressive Judaism, that's what we call Reform Judaism outside of the United States, and connect with Jews for whom Jewish practice at all, as well as freedom, were really new. It's 1994. On my arrival, I was fortuitously connected on my first day to a group of American leaders who were there with the American Jewish Committee. And they were amidst briefings and tours, so I tagged along to get to see the city. It was a great introduction before I set out on the open sunflower-lined road in a Soviet model car that was a few decades old and rattled a bit. I wasn't driving. That day we stopped at Babi Yar, the pastoral ravine that was the site of the mass killing of Jews by Nazis in 1941. Over 2 days in 1941, the Nazis, by their own account, murdered 33,771 people. When I arrived at Babi Yar in 1994, I had, like so many other students of the Holocaust, seen pictures and learned of the atrocities there. In 1941, you should know, was only the first of the atrocities there. We arrived at the site, and there was the new, or relatively new, giant menorah sculpture, a Jewish memorial built after Ukraine gained independence in 1991, after the fall of the Soviet Union. Previously, from 1976 until the early 90s, the only memorial at Babi Yar was one that marked the death of Soviet citizens. There was no mention of Jewish deaths there. It wasn't until after independence of Ukraine that a Jewish memorial was created. Still, throughout the intervening years, Babi Yar, an objectively beautiful spot just outside of the center of the city, was known and marked in our minds and our rituals. And people visited it as a pilgrimage site to reflect and remember. So on that day in July in 1994, I stood at Babi Yar. I was the rabbinic student, so ask the rabbi to lead Kaddish, right? I thought I understood the power of the verdant site. Apparently not. I froze. I wanted desperately to honor the memory of the deceased. I felt foolish in the time. I now understand the power of that. But finally, after some awkward minutes of silence, I found the familiar words, and the rest of the group joined me in prayer. Tuesday, just 3 days ago, as you likely saw in the news, Babi Yar was bombed by a Russian missile attack. The meaning of this bombing was perhaps best described by Natan Sharansky, former member of the Knesset in Israel and the chair of Babi Yar's advisory board. He said, "It is symbolic that Russian President Vladimir Putin starts attacking Kiev by bombing the site of Babi Yar, the biggest Nazi massacre." And Ukraine's Jewish President Zelensky said it was beyond humanity. What is the point of saying never again for 80 years if the world stays silent when a bomb drops on the same site of Babi Yar? History repeating. This week I was brought back to that moment of Babi Yar, and I was brought back to that life-changing journey to Ukraine. As I watched the news, as I'm sure we all did, I watched the news and viewed image after image of destruction, fear, flight from attack, people sleeping in metro stations underground, children gathered, hiding in basements, crowds at borders, cold, hungry children, family separation. I listened to numerous videos of our rabbinic colleagues, particularly Rabbi Alexander Duchovny, who was speaking from a basement of his building in Kiev. And as I watched and wondered and listened, I wondered about the people I had met many years ago. Because at the time, summer of 1994, I wasn't yet on the internet. Some people were. There were not easy ways to stay connected. I thought back to Anna Nemirovsky in Poltava. She and her husband Boris were then in their early 20s. They looked as if they could have walked off a New York street, and she spoke as if she was Israeli. Her Hebrew was so good. In a discussion with a group of teenagers and young adults in Poltava, she stood up and talked about how she lit Shabbat candles, which was unheard of then. She described step by step this unimaginable ritual to most of her community. Anna and Boris then were eager to start a progressive congregation in Poltava, and they were eager to make Aliyah. Their parents really didn't understand. They wanted to be Jewish, openly, and with pride. And I recall the 50 or so people in Korsun-Shevchenkovsky, say that fast, who crowded into a school auditorium on Erev Shabbat. There were those little sort of stereotypical like Russian faces with babushka, like scarves, and down to young children with sparkling eyes. No one knew what to expect, and only a few people could join in Shema with me. A young girl came forward to light the candles, and after Kaddish, I told the parents who were in the room about the tradition of blessing one's children. 5 pairs of parents came forward really awkwardly, and they read the Hebrew words via Russian transliteration. You should know that all of my teaching those weeks in Ukraine was through my speaking Hebrew and my new friend and translator, Itzik, translating from my Hebrew to his broken Hebrew to Russian. Good lag time. So these 5 sets of parents read a Russian transliteration of the priestly benediction. Some got the words right, some didn't. It didn't matter. They blessed their children with the same words I just blessed you all with. The room was silent. And I recalled another room, a small room in a rundown hotel in a city called Sumy. They were full of teenagers. These young people had just started a youth group 4 months earlier. They clamored to the meeting room. They had one little room. In that room, they had one tape recorder, Shabbat candlesticks, and a few other prized possessions that were kept under lock and key so they wouldn't disappear. The teens couldn't wait to ask questions. They wanted to sing Hebrew songs. They wanted to know what American teenagers did. They kept asking, what is it like to be Jewish in America? As the evening ended, they hugged me, and one girl cried. And then Lena, their youth advisor, said, wait, I would be back the next day. We could talk some more. And I recall Marina Bogoslavskaya, leader of the progressive Jewish congregation of Cherkasy. She gathered with 70 members of her community at the museum there. They didn't even have a synagogue to reclaim. We borrowed a little girl to hold the Havdalah symbols. I realized I forgot a spice box, pulled out a film canister. That's how it tells you when I was doing this. We put a little perfume sample in and made a spice box. And I taught them the melodies so familiar. How many times did you guys all sing them at camp? Taught them the Havdalah melodies. They didn't know all the words. It didn't matter. Some sang, some watched. And their faces were illumined by the Havdalah candle, transfixed, as if I was doing magic tricks before them. Walking through 7 Ukrainian cities nearly 30 years ago, I felt like my childhood hero, Nancy Drew. I was looking for clues, for symbols, for information. I was on a mission to find Jewish signs of Jewish life, which had been nearly erased since 1917. In 1994, Judaism in Ukraine was like those little green buds that we're looking for here as spring maybe appears, right? Just beginning to burst forth. My journey, of course, wasn't quite Nancy Drew's. It wasn't lighthearted, but it was a quest. I was determined to look for a place a mezuzah might have been, or a theater that had been a synagogue, anything. I sought a glimpse of the rich Jewish past in Ukraine, villages immortalized in literature by Sholem Aleichem, I think on stage at Deerfield High School tonight with Fiddler on the Roof. The first homes of so many of our grandparents, great-grandparents, the birthplace of Hasidism. The physical search was, as you might imagine, more disheartening than full of information. We saw places that were synagogues, that are now residences, were now then residences, factories, looking at plaques that referred to victims of fascism, but then never really referred to the Jews who died, just like at Babi Yar. It was really to look at a series of sequence of visits to cemeteries and saying Kaddish. But since that time, those little buds of Judaism have blossomed. Much has changed. Do you know that there are over 40 progressive congregations in Ukraine? There were before the war started. And there are other congregations, too, of other Jewish denominations, particularly Chabad. 40 progressive congregations. 2 rabbis serve Ukraine. Can you imagine? Rabbi Alexander Duchovny in Kiev and Rabbi Yulia Gri in Odessa. Presently, Rabbi Duchovny is still in Kiev, and he has been able to be in contact with the Jewish community. Some of you may have seen him. He spoke to the Union for Reform Judaism and others this week. Rabbi Greene had to leave with her daughter because her passport is Russian, and she wasn't safe. Rabbi Duchovny explained that his congregation, Hatikva, perfectly named, the Hope, founded by 20 young people 3 decades ago, has grown. The average age of his congregation is in the 40s. How young is that? And so a walk through the roads and streets of Ukraine is no longer as a detective into the past, but as an explorer in the present. I'm in awe of those communities, of the determination of their lay leaders, of the education, community building, and support given by the World Union for Progressive Judaism, Project Kesher, which some of you may be familiar with, founded here in Evanston, that I've long taught for, even in Moscow in 2003. Yet while much has changed, Jews in Ukraine have still struggled, even as their Judaism has survived. Rabbi Duchovny said the other day that the cost of living in Ukraine has been like that of Europe, but the salaries and pensions are nothing. People struggle to live still. And now there is war. People fear for their lives, families free, men are conscripted, children in preschool prepared to take cover in attacks. I know for me, as I hear my rabbinic colleagues speak, and as I hear my friend Karen Gershon, the CEO of Project Kesher, I hear what they're doing. Project Kesher volunteers are on the phone or on the internet with people who are fleeing, helping them to find lodging, helping them to reach funds anywhere so they can survive as they're fleeing. Set up a network of volunteers. I watch reports from the Joint Distribution Committee, see what HIAS and our federations are doing, and so many other organizations. They're meeting fleeing citizens at the border, finding lodging, providing funds, food, and moral support, and engaging in communication, some keeping people connected while they were walking for 15, 30 hours so they knew they weren't alone. I soak up news and information, give tzedakah, and reach out to those I know who have friends and family to see if I can be helpful, feeling helpless, even as I do. And I know that if we don't know people, the faces could well be a blur. For me, this walk down a sunflower-lined memory lane has given faces to people I'm not actually sure where they are anymore. So I've become determined to start looking. For some of us here in NSCI, there are names and faces. We have a long, long partnership with a Jewish community in Novograd-Volynsky, and we've been in touch with them. Cecile Levy forwarded us an email today. She's in touch with the leader of the community. The markets were closed. He went to buy some potatoes. He thought they would last. They don't have much contact outside of the city. They are people we know. In a few minutes, we'll join in Kaddish. When we stand in community, we stand in an unbroken chain to recite those words. We say Kaddish honoring people we know, people we love. And we, in our congregation, in our larger Reformed Jewish world, have always stood to say Kaddish for those who have no one to say Kaddish for them. We'll say Kaddish tonight for our dear ones, and we'll say Kaddish for those who died at Babi Yar in 1941, and this week in 2022. And this week, this Shabbat, I will not forget the words. Shabbat Shalom.